From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Mao. I'm the Deputy Librarian of Congress, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the beautiful Thomas Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress for this event this afternoon. We are very privileged to have with us the distinguished author, Clay Risen, and he will be talking about his book, The Bill of the Century. I am very honored that we, as part of the Law Library, I should mention that I'm also the Law Librarian of Congress, and representing the Law Library, I'm very glad that we were able to co-sponsor, along with the library's Interpretive Programs Office, the Serial and Government Publications Division, for this event. We've worked very collaboratively in preparing this event, and I hope you will enjoy yourself this afternoon. So, my colleague Robert Newland first met Mr. Risen at the Book Festival last summer, and enjoyed the event so much he came back and said we must have him back for an event here at the Library of Congress. And so that is where we started, and so we're very glad that he is able to join us today. It's also terrific because his book matches with an exhibition that is currently going on here at the Library of Congress, and that is our celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For those of you that may not have had an opportunity to see the exhibition, I hope maybe after the talk today you'll come upstairs to the second floor. It's on the other end of the building, and you'll take a look at that wonderful exhibition. If you don't have some time today, not to worry, the exhibition will continue for quite a few more months, and so I invite you to come back and take a look at that exhibition. As I mentioned, that exhibition commemorates the 50th anniversary of the landmark Civil Rights Act, and it also explores the events that shaped the civil rights movement during that time period, as well as the far-reaching impact that act has had on our society. Mr. Risen, who is very well known, is an editor for the New York Times op-ed section. He was also previously an assistant editor at the New Republic and a founding managing editor of the noted quarterly Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. His recent freelance work has appeared in such publications as The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, and The Washington Post. He's here, as I'd mentioned earlier, to talk about his book, The Bill of the Century, which is clearly the act of the century, and so we know what he's talking about. And in that book, he argues that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the single most important piece of legislation that was passed in the 20th century. That act ensured fairness in the public sphere to all races at a time when the South remained heavily segregated, but its reach extended beyond race to include all creeds and both sexes as well. And so we're very, very excited, and I hope you would join me in welcoming the author to come and speak about his book. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. And I'd just like to thank, before I start, everybody here at the library for hosting me today. It's just a real honor to be here. Speaking, I did an enormous amount of my research here over at the Archives Division. If you ever have a chance and the inspiration to do so, I would recommend going and checking some of the core documents that are in the NAACP collection, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights collection, a number of other collections, the Manny Seller collection, that really give you a firsthand feel of what went into making this bill. And if you don't have time to do that, I will second David's recommendation that you run over, don't walk, run to see the Civil Rights exhibit now or the next time you have a chance. It really is an amazing show. You know, after you've spent as much time as I have with material, you think you know everything, and just in the very cursory look that I had before I came over here to speak, I learned a lot that was new to me. So I recommend everyone checking it out. So 50 years ago, last July, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. That evening in the White House, hundreds of journalists, senators, and a smattering of civil rights leaders gathered around him to watch this historic event. But by the time Johnson signed the bill, the conventional chatter in the newspapers and in sort of the public was already about the Capitol Hill politics that went into the bill's passage. Most notably, of course, the historic filibuster that was mounted by the Southern Democrats in a vain attempt to defeat it. And this was truly an epic story. The CBS correspondent Roger Mudd every day went on television and recounted day by day, event by event, what went into that debate. Millions of people tuned in to watch, and thousands of people came from around the country just to sit in the galleries to watch the Senate as it debated and discussed and filibustered this bill. But lost in the ceremony of that day and the discussion about it in the days that followed was the very un-Washington origins of the Civil Rights Act, the evidence for which can partly be found in today's exhibit. And again, it's a real tribute to the strength of the archives here that they were able to go beyond just the superficial story of the Civil Rights Act to tell it in full. And to understand the bill, therefore, I would argue, and I will argue today, that we have to look beyond these immediate environs, beyond Capitol Hill, beyond the White House, to the civil rights movement itself, and to the broad grassroots coalition of conscience that, I will argue, made the bill such a success. There was never anything inevitable about the Civil Rights Act. President John F. Kennedy had run on a strong civil rights platform in 1960, but by early 1963, he had made it clear to the country and to their consternation to civil rights leaders that he was unwilling to risk his ties to the Southern Democrats by pushing for major legislation. Instead, he made do with some minor go-nowhere bills and the occasional symbolic action, like a star-studded reception for African-American leaders at the White House in February of 1963. And he hoped that in time, the good people of the South, the so-called silent South, would come around and would eventually bring justice to the region in a peaceful and politically calm way that would not disrupt his own agenda. But as his administration wore on, he realized that those people, that silent South that he was hoping to find, were fewer in number than he had first expected. At the same time, the civil rights movement in the South continued to push harder and harder for immediate action. First came the sit-ins, spreading from North Carolina throughout the region. Then came the Freedom Rides. And then came Ole Miss in the fall of 1962, in which it took federal marshals and the federalized National Guard to ensure that James Meredith was able simply to register for classes at the university. Each time, peaceful black protesters were met with violent white aggression, not just from know-nothing locals, but from all the way up to the governor's offices in Mississippi and Alabama. Still, as 1963 broke, Kennedy hoped for delay, and he introduced more go-nowhere legislation that he hoped would at least appease the people that were pushing him for more. But then came May and Birmingham, and Martin Luther King's decision to send school children into the streets to protest the city's Jim Crow segregation. I'd like to, if you will, allow me just to read a brief excerpt from my book, which gives you some sense of just how momentous this event was for the country. The momentum on civil rights changed at exactly 1 p.m. on May 2nd, 1963, when the doors of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, burst open, and dozens of school children poured forth into the warm spring sunlight, singing "We Shall Overcome." Wyatt T. Walker, the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the strategic visionary behind the protests, sent the children out in waves, a dozen here, a score there, coursing in different directions through and around Kelly Ingram Park, a block-sized plaza southeast of the church. Hundreds of onlookers, having heard about the march, were gathered around the park, as was a sizable chunk of the Birmingham Police Department. The children were marching without a parade permit, and officers immediately corralled them into waiting police vans. But the children kept coming. And when an officer saw Fred Shuttlesworth, a local preacher and one of the movement's leaders, standing on the side, he shouted, "Hey, Fred, how many more have you got?" "At least 1,000, Shuttlesworth replied. "God almighty." Shuttlesworth was hardly exaggerating. By the time the day's marches were over, 3 hours after they had begun, the police had run out of wagons and were resorting to school buses to take children to jail. 600 children were arrested that day. And the next day, the marches resumed. More children came, and so did the police, this time with the fire department, fire hoses, and police dogs. The marchers were hit with a light spray from the hoses at first, but when a determined core of them refused to retreat, the police captain in charge ratcheted up the stream to full blast, 100 pounds of pressure. The children did not budge, and when the retreating children saw their fellow marchers' example and turned around en masse, canine units came at them with dogs. That afternoon, Martin Luther King sent a telegram to President Kennedy. "Will you permit this recrudescence of violence in Birmingham to threaten our lives and deny our rights?" he asked. Kennedy did not respond, at least not that day, but he was watching, like the rest of the world. Photographers had snapped hundreds of pictures of German shepherds, their teeth sinking into young boys and girls. It made him sick, Kennedy told an aide, and he was not alone. The CBS News correspondent, Eric Severide, said, "A snarling police dog set upon a human being is recorded in the permanent photoelectric file of every human being's brain." Now, in presidential biographies and award-winning plays, we hear all too often the story about the political horse trading that went into the Civil Rights Act. And that's, of course, part of the story, and it's an important part. But if it were not for the actions of thousands of brave protesters like these in the South, and later across the country, in Chicago, in LA, in front of Lincoln Memorial, then President Kennedy and later President Johnson would never have felt the moral urgency of civil rights in the first place. Now, we can hear that urgency in a televised speech given by Kennedy on June 11, 1963, just weeks after the end of the Birmingham marches, in which he first informed the nation that he would soon send to Congress a comprehensive civil rights bill, a bill that his staff had written in direct response to the crisis in Alabama. In a speech that was broadcast before millions of Americans, but was largely unscripted, Kennedy said, "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay?" Those words, patience and delay, those words could not more clearly echo the very language being used by Martin Luther King in Birmingham, in his own speeches and in his famous letter from Birmingham jail. Kennedy was listening. That same pressure from people like King and hundreds of thousands of protesters, letter writers, lobbyists, and activists, made sure that the bill not only stayed on course, but actually gave strength and momentum as it went along. We're used to today hearing stories about legislation that falls apart or becomes watered down or compromised. One of the amazing things about the Civil Rights Act, aside from what it achieved on paper, was the fact that it actually grew stronger as it moved through the House and through the Senate. One of the most important parts of the bill, Title VII, which created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and introduced into federal law the very idea that job discrimination was unacceptable, was not even in the bill to begin with. Kennedy said that job discrimination was an issue that was just had to wait until later, that open access to public accommodations, voting rights, school desegregation, that was enough to deal with. He said, "I can't touch this," and all he would do in the original bill was to give a nod to endorsing legislation that someone else could, at their own free will, introduce later. Nevertheless, unions, civil rights groups immediately pressured him to do something. And in September and October 1963, Title VII was added. Now, as the bill made it into the Senate, and the wearing filibuster that the Southern Democrats mounted. Those same groups, civil rights groups, union groups, labor, as well as many churches. And people, just as an aside, people often ignore or forget the role that churches and synagogues, both Protestant and Catholic churches, as well as synagogues, played in getting the bill through. That not only the leadership, the various rabbinates and Catholic leaders and National Council of Churches, but also the grassroots. There was at one point a group of rabbis who came from Cincinnati, chartered a bus, came all the way to meet with as many senators as would meet with them, just to reiterate the fact that the rabbis of Cincinnati strongly supported the Civil Rights Bill. And you had that story repeated across the country. Church groups would write letters. They would get together after church in small towns in Iowa. In towns, you would have maybe just a few dozen people. They would all get together after church and sit down and write letters. It got to the point that senators and congressmen knew that Wednesdays, sometimes Tuesdays, but usually Wednesdays, would be heavy mail days, because the mail that would come in, and it would be mostly, form letters, but they would get hundreds of letters, almost all of it in support of the bill, and almost all of it from small towns around the country. Now, as the bill moved through the Senate and the wearing filibuster, these groups, along with President Johnson, made sure, through this pressure, that no compromise was raised and that no concessions were granted. The urgency, the logic of controversial legislation is often, or the strategy is usually loaded up with a lot of stuff that you can give away later, so you compromise once you hit rocky spots. And that's what had happened with the 1957 Civil Rights Act, with the 1960 Civil Rights Act. But this time around, it was different. The leadership, both in the White House and in the Senate, as well as the movement, adamantly refused to accept compromise. And the other factor was the Southerners refused to compromise. They saw this as their Armageddon. This was the debate that they were going to have to end all debates. So you had what really amounted to a war or a battle. You had, on one hand, the Southerners were organized into platoons. It was kind of interesting to go back and look at how well thought out they had their strategy. They had 6 platoons, or 3 platoons of 6 members each, and they would get up and give filibuster speeches, and then they would have some time off. And these were all older men, so you have to remember that they weren't able to get up and give those stem winders that they were famous for doing a few decades before. But they compensated for that, and so they were able to last a long time. At the same time, troops of young union organizers were equally as well organized, and they roamed the halls of Capitol Hill, ready to grab wayward senators or congressmen and bring them to the chamber for important votes. As soon as an important vote was coming up, they would send through the grapevine word that such and such senator or such congressman is not on the floor. He or she needs to be there, and they would send somebody to go grab them, to the point where they actually had to be talked down a little bit. The union leaders got word that their activists were being just a little too aggressive. But it worked. It worked. It got out the idea that this was not a regular piece of legislation. This was not something that you just had to show up for the final vote. You needed to be there on every vote, because every vote could be a sleeper vote that ended up weakening the bill. As Senator Richard Russell, the leader of the segregationist Southern Democrats, watched all of this happen, he realized that finally he was defeated. But it wasn't because simply the members of the Senate were so adamantly behind getting the bill out. It was because he could look out, he could look down the halls of the Senate, he could look up in the galleries, and whatever day it was, no matter how sort of mundane the debate was, he would see dozens, scores, hundreds of people from around the country, many of them wearing their priestly garbs if they were religious figures, or union members showing up in their work clothes, just to give a sense of who they were, where they were coming from, that this was really America was pushing for the bill. He later said ruefully, "We have been able to hold the line until all the churches joined the civil rights lobby." And around the country, as I said, these groups organized not only to come to Washington, but also to organize locally, not only writing letters, but also to make sure that when their congressmen came home, whether they were on vacation or just coming home for a work weekend, that oftentimes there would be someone to meet them there at the airport. And they were that well informed, the intelligence network was so good that they knew that when Senator Roman Houska, who is a conservative Republican, but he was sort of on the line, he was not sure which way he would go, that there was always a member of either the business community or the religious community there to meet him at the airport, so that the very first thing he heard was, the people of Nebraska want you to vote for this bill. And all of this was coordinated from Washington by an organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was a sort of clearinghouse that had been created in the late 40s through the 50s. That was not very active at that time, but really sprung up in the early 60s as a way of coordinating civil rights groups, union and religious groups. So you had the United Auto Workers, you had the National Council of Churches, you had the NAACP, you had SNCC, all of these groups coming together and being on the same page, so that when they sent out letters, when they sent out communications to their members, when they called people in, that they were doing it at the time when they weren't going to be clogging the halls with some other group, that everyone was on message. It was really amazing today when we think about social media and how easy it is to do stuff like this, that they were all doing this with phone calls and telegraphs and mimeographed sheets of paper. Their distribution network was absolutely amazing. There were, in the end, about 60 groups, large and small, around the country underneath the LCCR banner, and it absolutely made the difference. In short, to understand the Civil Rights Act is to understand it as an instance of democracy in action in the broadest, most ideal sense. Not just as elected officials doing their jobs behind closed doors, and not just of crass politicians working for righteous ends, but of ordinary citizens petitioning their government for redress and receiving it. And one of the really important parts of the civil rights story, the strategy behind it, is that when the bill came into the House and came into the Senate, there were only 45 senators who were willing to support it. And almost all and then of course you had about 18 or 20 who were adamantly opposed to it. So you had this gap in between of 35 senators who were on the fence. Now, they were on the fence for a variety of reasons. Some of them were small government conservatives. They didn't like the idea of legislation like this. Some of them leaned towards Southern Democrats for not so much ideological reasons, but they were allies and they didn't want to anger Richard Russell. Others simply thought the filibuster was a valuable thing, that regardless of what the legislation was, it was a valuable thing that needed to be protected. And so voting for cloture was improper. It violated the Senate's sense of tradition. So winning those members over was the critical part of getting the bill through. And this is where all of these activists focused their energy. And what I think is really important about this story is that it wasn't simply a matter of activists showing up, of activists calling every senator they could find, that it was actually not only a very well-coordinated grassroots effort, but also a very tactically and strategically informed effort. There was a very good sense from the top to the bottom of what had to happen, the dominoes that had to fall in order to get enough of those 35 senators to come over. The key, of course, was to win over enough conservative Republicans. Now, you had the Southern Democrats who were never going to vote for it. You had the liberal Democrats who were, of course, going to vote for it. You had a number of liberal Republicans, not a whole lot, but a good number. So then you had moderate and conservative Republicans. Now, some of them you could write off, but most of them were actually on the table, and most of them came from the Midwest. Most of them were small town, had started off as small town representatives, had moved up. Everett Dirksen, who is the Senate Minority Leader, was both the leader of this group and sort of the archetype of this kind of representative, this kind of senator, this kind of congressman. And so figuring out how do you get those people to come over. Now, part of that was a matter of backroom dealing, and of course that happened, and that's what we're familiar with as a story. There was backroom dealing. There were a lot of talks with Dirksen. Sat back with him in his bourbon and smoke-filled room. He actually did have a bourbon and smoke-filled room. I'm not making that up. Where they would retire after the day's ends, and a number of senators, mostly staffers for senators, and some outside groups, as well as Department of Justice and White House people, would all sit together and they'd talk and they'd go through. Dirksen had a number of a couple of different lists of amendments that he wanted to issue. some of them started off, some of them were pretty aggressive. But what's amazing and what's really, I think, really telling about the important part of the story is that Dirksen ended up folding. And it's often sort of glossed over, but very little that he asked for actually got into the bill. There were a few things, a few changes to the EEOC, a few things that rise to the level of noteworthiness, but nothing that really watered down the bill in any significant way. And a lot of those initial demands that he put forward, he pulled back after pressure from interest groups really started to get to him. And he started to, on the one hand, I think really believe that he could play an important role. He was listening to what not just other congressmen and not just what the White House was telling him, but what every priest that came through his office, every local business person said coming through his office, that you need to do this, that you're important, you're the cornerstone of this, of making this happen. He started to believe that. And he had a sizable ego, as a lot of senators do. He started to see, yes, I can be the big man, I can be a great man in history. But I think he also was fundamentally persuaded by this call. He was someone who, like a lot of Midwesterners at the time, had grown up in small towns that were very much still inflected with the legacy, particularly in Ohio and Indiana. He was from Illinois. In this area where it's still inflected with the ethos of the Civil War, of abolitionism, and he, like a number of other members of Congress, were finally persuaded that this was something that they could do to contribute to that storyline. He later would talk about how the civil rights, how making this happen was the single most important thing in his career, that when he finally came out on the floor of the Senate and said, this is finally something that I've decided, that I've given a lot of thought to, that this is something that has to happen. Even when he very easily could have gone the other direction, I think speaks to a certain moral clarity on his part. And that's saying something, because he was, in a lot of other ways, quite the opportunist. So you have a lot of stories like Dirksen's story. You have people who, in their own individual way, whether they were senators, whether they were congressmen, gave thought to what it meant to vote for civil rights, whether this was simply because it was something they'd never given thought to, they never really thought that they would need to vote for this, or maybe it's something that went against some of their political ideals, or even some of their social ideals. Maybe some of them even harbored segregationist views. But over time, over the course of the filibuster, and this is where actually the filibuster helped in a way, because it gave time for not just for people to politic, but for the country to start to think about and talk about, what does it mean for us to pass civil rights legislation? What does this bill mean? What will it mean if we don't do it? And for groups to, around the country, for groups to come to their own conclusion and start to talk to Washington and to bring pressure. And in the end, almost every one of those Midwestern senators who were on the fence about the bill came over and voted not only for cloture, but voted for the bill itself. Remember, there are two different votes. Cloture more or less made sure the bill was going to pass, but there was still you had to get 51 votes, and a number of them came over even for that and said, I will not only support ending the filibuster, but I affirmatively believe that this bill has to happen. And I don't think that would have happened simply with politicking. I think that if this had been left in the back rooms and the bourbon-soaked conversations, that there would have been compromise, that there would have been some effort to come up with a more sort of in the middle, whatever the two positions were, whatever Dirksen really wanted. There might have been something in the end that was much less than what we call the Civil Rights Bill today, but it was because there was the sunlight of public attention on this legislation, because Roger Mudd was on TV every day talking about it, because people were hearing about it in church, they were hearing about it in their union halls, they were hearing about it in circulars going around from civil rights groups, that this was something that you could not avoid at the time. Now, the struggle ultimately for this bill was not simply about that time, too. I don't want to give the impression that civil rights simply suddenly became this thing that everyone paid attention to. Particularly with some of these groups, they've been fighting for civil rights, and not just the civil rights groups, but labor groups and church groups, had been pushing for civil rights for decades. And it took decades for this to finally get onto the Capitol Hill plate, and to get onto the plate of get in front of the rest of the public. But the bill that passed and went to the president's desk now 51 years ago this year was a rare thing indeed. It was a piece of legislation that started off because of public pressure that would not have been there at all without public pressure. It was strong. It was a strong bill. But it actually grew stronger as it moved forward. It picked up Title VII. And also Title VII itself grew stronger because it added gender. Title VII itself did not originally include gender. It was very focused on pretty much on race and ethnicity. And in the House debate, it picked up gender and sex discrimination, which itself changed the very face of the job scene, of the workplace. None of this could have happened without the intense, often bitter, but ultimately successful interplay between the powers that be in Washington and the ordinary citizens that they purport to govern. And that's why I consider the 1964 Civil Rights Act to be, in a very literal sense, the bill of the century. Thank you. And I left a good amount of time to answer questions. If anybody has any, I'm happy to talk at length. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, I would think that you couldn't help but think about today's world as you studied that period, and I certainly did, and I want you to identify for us some of the ways in which you think the world has changed, the United States government and the people of the United States have changed in ways that might make it harder to achieve that success.
Sure. It's a fantastic, it's one that I think about all the time, because in some ways, in a lot of ways, the world is, or the country, is a much more just place and a much better place because of the Civil Rights Act, but also I think because of what the Civil Rights Act embodied, a general turning of the country toward the idea that the public, society, but as well as also the government, that we have an obligation toward equality, that we should put it as not just something that's in our documents, and it's not just something that we sort of bracket across a few paragraphs and say, well, you know, equality for certain groups, but that we should actively seek to expand equality. And that's not something that we can all agree on all the time. We don't all agree on what equality means, how should equality be extended, but it is an urgency that I think wasn't really there certainly before the 50s. I mean, it certainly was there with some people, but as a national point, as something we can all basically agree on, I think that is something that's very different today. And I think the Civil Rights Act was part of that, but it was as much a function of that change. So was the Voting Rights Act. So were any number of other parts of the Great Society. That said, I think that in some ways, because of a lot of the politics that surrounded that era and the tumult that it caused in our political scene, it's much harder to get a lot of things done today. You know, sometimes people put your question a little differently and say, well, could we have passed the Civil Rights Act today? And you know, part of the difficulty is that one of the reasons that we have a hard time thinking about passing the Civil Rights Act today is because of the changes that made the Civil Rights Act possible back then. The way that political alliances were breaking down in the early 60s, and yet you still had two political parties that were ideologically heterogeneous. You had liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, so that you could have alliances that came together, and you had people that didn't have to follow party line because there wasn't a party line in the way that we have them today. Today is just much different. Another thing, and something I didn't talk about too much, was the success of the Civil Rights Act, of the lobbyists, the grassroots lobbyists that went into making the bill possible, became a model for future lobbying. And people, particularly on social issues, in the late 60s and through the 70s, looked back to that as a lesson. And that, you know, that's a good thing. And people should learn from that example. But I think that that's part of a general turn that we've seen, and I think we've suffered from today, in which lobbying groups and large pools of money have an untoward and unbalanced influence on the legislative process, to the point where we just don't get a lot of legislation that doesn't get approved by a relatively small number of interest groups. And, you know, in some ways that's an ironic consequence, because it was a great thing that interest groups came to the Civil Rights Act in the way they did. But I think today we see something very different. And, you know, but the other answer I would give is that, you know, in some ways the civil rights movement, the civil rights issue, particularly as it pertained to African Americans and minorities, was a singular thing. I mean, I think it was, we are still today grappling with the fact that, you know, our country is built on a sin, is built on the fact that we, in the Constitution, endorse slavery, and we've been struggling with that. And the Civil Rights Act is a great landmark in the movement to try to compensate, and we'll never quite sort of remove that stain, but to compensate for it and to deal with it. You know, there just aren't a lot of other issues, I think, that quite strike the heart of what America is, and that people, that motivate, that drive people in that same way. I think that there are civil rights issues that are very important today. And I mean, in this sense, civil rights in a broad sense, whether it's gay rights, women's rights, environmental rights, you know, depending on where you live, are you subject to more pollution or not? These things still frustrate us, and they still are things that we have to deal with. But it's hard to imagine anything today that rises to the moral immediacy of dealing with civil rights at the time. Yes, sir.
As a sophomore at Georgetown, I had the privilege of being the merest, most trivial foot soldier on the farthest fringes of some of these events.
Congratulations.
And I remember vividly some of the vignettes you recounted in the book, and they're beautiful. It's a wonderful job. Thank you for writing it. You mentioned the addition of gender, and as I recall it, I read the book a couple of months ago, but as I recall it, this was surfaced as a ploy by a Southern Democrat in the House, Judge Smith, you know, to try to muddy the water at the very least. Did you get any sense from the data that there were people who saw, apart from the immediate tactical situation, the impact on the bill in the House, that this might actually be a foot up the ladder and actually start something serious? Did anybody see that
You mean
the inclusion of gender in?
Yeah, well, it's a thanks for asking, because it's a great story. You know, so Judge Smith was the head of the Rules Committee, very powerful Southern senator and Southern representative. And but the funny thing about Judge Smith is, if I don't know what his epitaph says, but if you can imagine his legislative epitaph, it would have two things on it. The first would be that he was a huge opponent of civil rights. He was a very violently pro-segregation. But the other was, he was very pro-women's rights. And in a weird way, we can't imagine this today. Before the 1960s, the women's rights movement was not always in line with what today we consider progressive issues. Women often felt strategically at odds with civil rights. They felt like they were in competition for, you know, political attention or for, you know, how it would shake out. Oftentimes, and if you just think about it, just because you're pro-women's rights doesn't mean that you're going to be pro-civil rights. You can be in fact, there were a number of prominent women's rights advocates before the 60s who were pretty much out and out segregationists. So he fit into that. He was, but he had a long record of promoting women's rights in the House. He was always either a sponsor or co-sponsor of almost every year or every 2 years. There was an Equal Rights Amendment, some version of an ERA that was introduced starting in the 30s. So he had been around there a long time, and he was always pushing it. He was best friends from an early age with some of the leaders of the women's rights movement. And nevertheless, he was also, an adamant opponent of the bill. So when the bill came to the floor of the Senate, or floor of the House, it had gotten through him and basically been rammed through his committee. So he was already, in a sense, defeated. And I think he took a somewhat ironic position on this. And he was put up to it in part by some of his allies in the women's rights movement. They had already separately been talking about, here's this great civil rights bill. How do we get women's rights into it? And then Title VII was added, and they said, there, we'll add it, because we can already go to restaurants. We don't really, school segregation isn't an issue for us, but this is going to be one of our great best shots. And then Title VII came along, and they said, well, job discrimination is a huge problem for women. We need to get gender added to that. Now, there were some women in the House, and they were allies, but some of them were nervous about weighing down the civil rights bill. They said, I don't really want to, I think we should do that with separate legislation. Others were not going to win over a lot of support, right, if they added it. They were backbenchers or just weren't. But so the women's group said, well, let's go to Judge Smith. He'll do it. And whether he does it honestly or as a joke, he'll agree to do it. And people will kind of believe it if he does it. So they went, and he said immediately, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I want to do that. Yeah. So he gets up on the floor of the House. I think it was February 7th. And he says, by the way, I think we've had this. And he had already gone on TV and said he was going to do this. This was not a secret. He got up and said, I'd like to add, a very simple amendment was said, and sex to the list of things that you could not discriminate against, or bases on which you cannot discriminate in the workplace. And immediately people started laughing, and there were all these jokes, and it's not a good moment in the history of the House. There are a lot of bad sort of, these kind of old man jokes from the, about their wives and whatever. But it passed, and it actually passed overwhelmingly. So Smith had, I think, two sort of, and this is where I mean he was sort of thinking ironically. On the one hand, he had sort of accepted that the bill was going to pass. I mean, he had lost his battle. He could kind of see down the road, and he figured it was going to pass. So on the one hand, he thought, what, let me at least just, mess with people a little bit. Let me throw it out there. Maybe it'll cause some debate. Maybe it'll make things confusing. It'll weigh the bill down. Who knows what'll happen, right? I'll just kind of play the trickster. But I think he also felt like, look, if this is going to pass, and I think it's going to pass, there's nothing really I can do about this other stuff. I'm not going to stop the civil rights element. But if I can do this, I do really care about women's rights. So I tie that to this, and I'll get that through. So it's sort of a win-win for me. I think that's ultimately how he saw it. He never explained himself, and of course, people around him all spun it in different ways. But I think if you look at the record and you look at the kind of person he was, the things he said about the bill in general, and where he's had this kind of fatalist view about things once it passed out of the Rules Committee, I think that's probably the best way to understand why that man with that background would introduce that to the legislation. Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
I just got to talk first. That's right on the
Mm-hmm.
And he spoke a lot about LBJ, how to get the sausage made, so to speak, and I didn't hear you talk about that, so I just
He and I part ways on the interpretation of that part of the story. I think that Johnson was played a very important part in the bill. In its passage, but I believe the record shows that he largely failed in terms of the sausage making. That there was only one senator whose vote he won over, and that was someone who simply agreed not to vote. They just said, I will, instead of voting against cloture, I will not vote. There's a pretty good record of him failing. There's a great recording of him trying to win Robert Byrd over. Robert Byrd was in the hospital briefly, and Johnson called him up and said, please come over. Byrd was an acolyte of Johnson's, and yet Byrd said, absolutely no, there's no way I'll do this. I'm going to be behind the filibuster until I die. And in fact, he was the last one, he being one of the younger members of the Southern Democratic Caucus, got up and gave a 23-hour personal filibuster at the very end. So that was his answer to Johnson. And moreover, Johnson, people forget that as much as Johnson was the master of the Senate in the 50s, he was a tyrant. And when he left the Senate, everyone was really happy. He was not someone that a lot of people had loyalty to. And they were very happy that Mike Mansfield took over. Mike Mansfield was a very genial, very, someone who respected his fellow senators and, arguably didn't do as good a job as Johnson. Legislation slowed down, but people liked him. They didn't like Johnson. And when Johnson went back throughout his time as vice president and then even early on, as president, he had a hard time with rank and file people. Now, there are individual people he could go to and he could say, hey, we have a long history together, let's make a deal. And, and that did happen. And so you see examples of that through the early, but I think Johnson was wary of overstretching his reach. At the same time, there's one other consideration, is that Johnson jumped into this boat in midstream, right? The bill had already been written. There was already a strategy behind it. There was already a group in the Department of Justice, a group in the Senate, and a group in the House who were all on the same page, meeting, talking about how to get the bill through. And Johnson, on the one hand, could say, okay, they've got that going. He also wasn't quite sure they had the right strategy. But so he was facing an election in '64 that he had to be very careful about. I mean, at the time, you remember this is early '64, Goldwater wasn't obviously the candidate. Rockefeller was the one that people were really afraid of. And Johnson feared that if the bill failed, or if the bill were still just if it hadn't been passed by the time the election came up, that Rockefeller would destroy him. Because Rockefeller would say, I'm more liberal. I would get it done. I'm the real liberal on civil rights. And he would win over all these civil rights voters. So Johnson had to sort of be very calculated about where he put himself. At the same time, he wanted to be in a place where he could claim credit for the bill if it passed. So one of the things that I think is noteworthy about Johnson's performance is that even though he was trying to wheel and deal, and of course he did talk to everybody, he was talking to Hubert Humphrey, he was talking to Dirksen, he was in the mix, but in terms of actually contributing to things, he did something very un-Johnsonian. He was someone who's not known as a speaker. There are no memorable Lyndon Johnson speeches before he became president. They're all stump speeches. They're all, these kinds of, you get up and you say what people want to hear and then you go on. But starting on November 27th, 1963, which is the first speech he gave as president in front of a joint session of Congress, everyone in the country was watching. It's right after Kennedy had been killed. Johnson found this rhetorical power. He was suddenly able to just deliver these incredibly moving speeches on a lot of things, but on civil rights in particular. And civil rights, somehow he just found this voice. And if you go back and listen to the speech or read it, it's very moving. He says, right up front, the first thing we can do, the most important thing we should do to honor Kennedy's legacy is to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And he repeated that through his State of the Union, through every speech that he gave. I mean, and you can go back to the public papers of the presidency, which have every public address that he gave, and pretty much every single thing, with a press conference or a speech to Democratic leaders or some chicken dinner somewhere, he talks about the importance of civil rights in general and of the Civil Rights Bill in particular. And he said two things that are really important. First of all, he said that this bill has to pass. The country wants it to pass. We have a moral obligation to pass this bill. But the second thing he said was that the Senate has to pass it. And it was a very calculated, very brilliant way to put it, because on the one hand, he was saying, he said, I won't accept anything less from you guys than the whole bill, and I'm going to keep you in the Senate until I'm going to demand that you don't leave the Senate until you pass this bill. But he was also saying, it's your responsibility. If you don't do it, that's your fault. If you don't, I'm going to be very disappointed, but it's not my job. Right? He was making it very clear that there were these lines so that if the bill failed, he could say, that's Hubert Humphrey's fault. That's not my fault. But if it passed, which it did, he could then say, we did it, I did it, there we go, I signed it. Everyone remembers the president who signs the bill. They don't remember the people that passed the bill. And he knew that. So I think that Johnson played a very important role, but I think oftentimes his role is misunderstood. So if that answers, that's a long way of answering the question. What else can I answer? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So you did some research here at the Library of
Yes.
Congress. You mentioned some of the collections that you looked at. Could you be more specific? Like
Yes.
a highlight, like a treasure trove? Like what?
Let me tell you. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights Papers, which are not an obvious collection to find, they are amazing, fantastic papers. What they do, and the reason why they're so fantastic, is because they collect a lot of this stuff that you wouldn't. There was the Quakers had a group, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the FCNL. They have a lot of their stuff. right? So you find, like I said, there are 60 different groups organized in this, some of them fairly obscure from an archival point of view, but nevertheless important, both in the aggregate and, they represented lots of people. So the LCCR papers give you a window into all of that, and it gives you a sense of really the organization of how it all came together. The NAACP papers are amazing. One of the things that unfortunately we don't have here, or the library doesn't have, is the personal papers of Clarence Mitchell, which I believe are still held by his family. He was the head lobbyist for the NAACP here in Washington. But they do have a lot of, I think there's probably a lot, I've never seen those papers, they're not publicly accessible. But I imagine there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of stuff from him, there's a ton of stuff from Roy Wilkins. There's really valuable insight into how Roy Wilkins worked with other civil rights groups to get the bill shaped, as well as how the NAACP organized activism and was able to, sort of turn on and off activists as they needed them on certain issues. So that's a fantastic collection. The other one that's really noteworthy is the Emanuel Seller papers. So he was the head of the House Judiciary Committee, very liberal guy from New York, had already been there for 50 years. I mean, he was a very, long in the tooth representative. But the bill started in his committee, and really once it left his committee was more or less in shape, except for the gender addition and some other tweaks in the Senate. So, and he has a lot of material about coordination. You see how on the level of just the representative's office, there was coordination with other groups, with outside groups, with other representatives, coordination and conversation with conservative Republicans. It's really a great insight, and I think that's the three big ones that are to hear. But collectively, they make up an enormous amount of the ground that I covered in my archival work.
Tell them the story about Roger Mudd's vote by vote challenge.
Oh.
That's a wonderful story.
So one of the things that I guess is still true, I think it's still true, you couldn't have video cameras in the gallery. You couldn't have note-taking in the gallery. So everyone had to just sit in the gallery. And so if you see these great, and they have some of them over in the exhibit, these great sketches of the Senate, of the debate going on, those were all Howard Brody. Howard Brody was the sketch artist. He would have to leave and Roger Mudd has a really great autobiography. It's a really fun book about media, because he's a longtime Washington guy, and so he has these great details about how Brody would just sit there watching and just come up with his picture and then run outside and draw it. But Mudd had to do the same thing. So Mudd couldn't take notes. But Mudd was filing morning reports. He was going on TV. He was filing wire stories. So just an amazing, it's just this constant, rapid movement. And when it came time for the vote, what he would do is, the other thing was he would broadcast often from out on the Capitol lawn until the Southern Democrats decided that, even though they liked him personally, he was is a really personable guy, they said, this is just not helping us. So they arranged it so that he had to go off Capitol property. So he basically stood on the sidewalk and would broadcast. But then when the vote came on, the other thing he would do is when he broadcast, he would have a board that had the number of days. And every day he would go on national television, there would be a board, and it would say, this is how many days the filibuster has been going on. And that's not activism. He's just saying, this is what's happening. And remember, back then, a filibuster meant that nothing else was discussed. This was before the Byrd Rule went into effect. So you had only civil rights being debated. So a lot of people were just getting very frustrated that nothing else was happening. So on the day of the vote, on the day of the filibuster vote, Mudd was outside, and he had a tally board with the votes, and he had runners. So someone inside, and every time a vote would happen, they'd run outside, and there was a little phone, and they could call down to a telephone that was down where he was, where he was standing, and that person, he had a little, an assistant there, and they would say, okay, such and such, Senator Aiken, Senator Kuechel just voted, yes to end the filibuster, and he would put it up on the board, and it would count down, and it just added a level of drama to, and a one that the public could immediately tune into. What's amazing is, as much as we look back and say, well, obviously this was going to happen, the vote was really close. They needed 67 votes. It was 71 votes. And those last 4 votes were not really sure until, some people weren't even sure that it would happen until it happened. Some of the lobbyists there, and there were anti-bill lobbyists, there were some pro-segregation lobbyists who had some dark, I get into this in the book, but some business tycoons who didn't want the bill to happen had funded this group. And so they were convinced that they were going to win. They thought that they had, that it was going to be close, but that they'd get, that there would only be 64, 65 votes. And so they were counting down. There was one really memorable story. There was the senior senator from California, Claire Engel, who was, he had brain cancer. And at the time, he was still with it enough, but he was going downhill fast. And but he insisted on being there for the vote. And so when it came time for his vote, a Navy corpsman actually rolled him down in a stretcher, and they read his name, and he didn't do anything. And so I forget who was the clerk, said, "Well, nothing's happening." And then the junior senator, Tommy Kuechel, who deserves a lot more credit than he gets for, but he is. There's a very nice photo of him in the exhibit. He does get credit there, but he deserves more credit in general. He's a great guy. He said, "Wait, I think I know what just happened," because by then Engel couldn't really move his arms, and he said, "I think I saw his eye move, and I think he's with it enough to answer questions." So he went over to him and he said, and I think I'll get this right, he said, if I think that you're blinking your eye as a way of saying I. If that's true, blink your eyes right now. And he blinked his eyes. So he said, "Okay, clerk, will you read his name again?" And he will blink his left eye. And if he does that, then you can record that as an I. And so the clerk said, Senator Engel, and then blinked his eye, and they recorded his vote. And he died 3 weeks later. But it was really just a great sort of, of the moment scene for what was overall a momentous day. I think that's actually all the time that we have. I'm a few minutes over. I'll be signing books at the back, so if you have any other questions or just want to chat, I'm happy to talk. Thank you all very much for being here. This was a lot of fun.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.